Mark Smith, an official in the British Foreign Office, has resigned in protest at the continued arms sales by the British government to the State of Israel. This matters. It matters a lot. In his letter of resignation, first revealed by the journalist Hind Hassan, he declared he could no longer carry out his duties in the knowledge that this department may be complicit in war crimes. He says he's a former penholder on the Arms Exports Licensing Assessment in MENAD, that's the Middle East and North Africa Directorate, and says he's a subject matter expert in the domain of arms sales policies. He says specifically, each day we witness clear and unquestionable examples of war crimes and breaches of international humanitarian law in Gaza perpetuated by the State of Israel. He adds that senior members of the Israeli government and military have expressed open genocidal intent. Adds further, Israeli soldiers take videos, deliberately burning and destroying and looting civilian properties, and openly admitting to the rape and torture of prisoners. He goes on to highlight that over half of Gaza's homes and over 80% of commercial properties have been damaged and destroyed, that whole streets and universities have been demolished, humanitarian aid is being blocked, civilians left with no safe quarter to flee to. He notes that Red Crescent ambulances have been attacked, schools and hospitals are regularly targeted. Summing up, these are war crimes. He goes on, there is no justification for the UK's continued arms sales to Israel, and yet somehow it continues. He says he's raised it at every level of the Foreign Office, including through an official whistleblowing investigation, and all he's had back is a thank you, we have noted your concerns. Damningly, he says that while ministers claim the UK has one of the most robust and transparent arms exports licensing regimes on earth, that this is the opposite of the truth. He believes, having raised serious concerns of illegality in the department, which are disregarded in this way, that this is deeply troubling. Now let's listen to him being interviewed on BBC Radio 4's Today programme.
For everybody watching their TV screens now, what we can see are appalling acts of violence perpetrated on civilians, on civilian property, and so on. Most people, I think, watching that would think this is absolutely horrendous. For me personally, my profession or former profession, as of last week, was to advise the government on the legality of arms sales. And when you look at what constitutes a war crime, it's actually quite clear, even from what you see in open source on the TV, that the State of Israel is perpetrating war crimes in plain sight. Anybody who has a kind of basic understanding of these things can see that there are war crimes being committed, not once, not twice, not a few times, but quite flagrantly and openly and regularly.
Did you raise this internally, this view?
Yes, so I raised it with the new Foreign Secretary, and I raised it at pretty much every level in the organisation. That's my duty, and that would be quite normal, I think, for public servants. We're very used to upholding the law, and so we would normally raise things internally that we might have a question over, particularly if we have subject matter specialism, as I do. So I raised it internally.
And how did the Foreign Secretary respond?
I'm not at liberty to kind of go into detail about exactly how that internal process went, but I resigned from my role, and I resigned because of this issue. So you can put the pieces together, but suffice it to say that any response was not satisfactory.
So as he notes here, diplomatically, he is of course a former diplomat, the response he's got after raising this at the very highest level, up to and including the Foreign Secretary, is not satisfactory. Now, a few things here. It's extremely rare for a British official of this sort to resign in these circumstances, ending their career as they know it, and then putting themselves out there, something they would never have expected in the job that they have. Not least, it should be said, the context, which is important here, the viciousness to which critics of the Israeli state are subjected to. He's clearly only done this because of the gravity of the crime. Now, this also exposes that changes in government policy, which have come about with a change in government, require a big health warning, a big caveat. We know that the government has rightly dropped the spurious legal objection lodged by Rishi Sunak's government to the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor's request for arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and his defence minister as the bare minimum, just accepting international law, not trying to obstruct international law. And as a result, Benjamin Netanyahu snubbed the Foreign Secretary David Lammy. But they failed to publish the last government's legal advice, which would reveal what they have adjudicated on the question of Israel committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, which legally necessitates ending weapons sales. We were told that the UK government was going to end arms sales to Israel, but then told that this wouldn't happen for a long time because it would only be a ban on offensive rather than defensive weapons, as if that clear delineation could happen. And as the campaign against the arms trade point out, it was meaningless without banning exports of components of F-35 combat jets. So the UK government under Labour and Keir Starmer continues to arm Israel as it commits flagrant war crimes every day in plain sight. It is therefore complicit in what should be regarded as one of the worst crimes of our age. Now here's another reason why the likes of Mark Smith resigning is so important. It must be made clear at a future date that there were no excuses. Ignorance cannot be claimed. People, particularly those in power, must not be allowed to say, we didn't know what was really happening. We know exactly what's happening. Because these obscene war crimes are being committed every day, knitted together by, as Mark Smith notes, the genocidal rhetoric of Israeli leaders, which crucially exposes their intent. As Raz Sigal, the Israeli-American associate professor of genocide and Holocaust studies, pointed out, he pointed this out back in October, back at the very start, it is extraordinarily rare for intent to be so explicitly stated. We could not have more evidence. From the very beginning, Israeli leaders and officials made it clear what they were going to do. The most clear predictor of what was going to happen, what foreshadowed what would happen, what told us what was going to happen, was what Israeli leaders and officials said they were going to do from the very start. They said it, and then they did it. And we have more ever since documented evidence of these war crimes and crimes against humanity than practically any atrocity ever committed in the history of human civilization. It is being live streamed to us every day. There is no subtlety. It is there before our very eyes. Now, this is an important point because this knowledge, of course, goes for the British government. They are aiding and abetting these heinous crimes despite having all the evidence. As Mark Smith notes, what we can see from the public domain is sufficient. But the way he speaks suggests that's on top of information in the private domain. But the point he's making is you don't need that private information because it's so obvious based on what we have in public. We've got to hold them to account for that. I would know that the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, set up by lawyers and academics, is raising money to take politicians to court for their complicity in this grave crime of historic proportions. Now, Mark Smith has done a great service. He has shown great courage. Others must follow his example. You know what's happening. You know the extent of the depravity, of the scale of the crime. You know our government has helped facilitate this monstrous crime from day one. Do you too want to be complicit? If not, then speak out. Yes, you may fear consequences, but those consequences are nothing compared to the fate of the Palestinian people. We are watching the genocide of a people being live streamed every day. If we have any power at all, to do something, anything about that, it is incumbent on us all to use it. Better that than to be tortured for the rest of our lives by the knowledge that we did not do what we could in the face of one of the worst horrors of our age. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your thoughts and your comments. Do help keep the show on the radio at patreon.com/Owen84. We have something very big that we're working on, which you will see. It's a lot of work. And you can listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. I'll speak to you soon.